He needed a wife on paper to keep the timber claim. She needed a roof that did not leak. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 required that a claimant plant and cultivate 10 acres of timber on a quarter section of public land within 4 years and maintain it for 8 more. The act also required that the claimant be the head of a household, which in the language of the federal government meant a man with a wife or a widow with children, and Jonas Hamel was neither. He was 32 years old and unmarried, and he had 160 acres of good bottomland along the Elkhorn River in northeastern Nebraska, and he had planted 12 acres of cottonwood and box elder and Osage orange according to the requirements of the act, and the trees were growing well, and the land was his in every way except the one way that mattered, which was legally, because he was not the head of a household and the federal government inspector was coming in November. And if Jonas did not have a wife by November, the claim would be denied, and the 4 years of backbreaking planting and cultivating and watering and nursing small fragile trees through drought and grasshoppers and hailstorms and the relentless Nebraska wind would be for nothing. He did not want a wife. He wanted a wife on paper. He wanted the legal fact of a wife on the federal paperwork, without the domestic and emotional complication of one, because Jonas Hamel was a man who had deliberately and carefully organized his life around solitude, the way other men organized their lives around sociability. And the solitude suited him, and the trees suited him, and the combination of the two, a quiet man alone in a quiet forest that he had planted himself with his own hands, was as close to contentment as Jonas Hamel had ever come or ever expected to come. The woman who needed a roof was named Olive Mackey. She was 29 years old, and she had been living in a soddy 4 miles east of the Elkhorn with her Aunt Prudence, until Prudence died in September, and the soddy, which had never been adequate, became uninhabitable when the fall rains came, and the roof, which was sawed over cottonwood poles, collapsed in 3 places, and the cold water came through in streams, and the walls began to soften and crumble, and the house, which had been built by Prudence's husband 20 years earlier, began the slow, inevitable process of returning to the earth from which it had originally been made. Olive did not have the money to repair the soddy. She did not have the money to rent a room in town. She had a small income from sewing. She was a capable and precise seamstress who made shirts and trousers and occasionally dresses for the farmers and their wives in the surrounding area. But the income was small and irregular, and entirely insufficient for anything beyond food and thread and the occasional yard of fabric. The arrangement was first proposed by the postmaster, whose name was Dooley, and who knew everyone's business, because the mail told him everyone's business, whether he wanted to know it or not, and Dooley always wanted to know. Dooley knew that Jonas needed a wife on paper to satisfy the federal requirement, and Dooley knew that Olive needed a roof over her head before the first snow, and Dooley knew that these two needs, placed side by side like 2 halves of a broken plate, formed a solution that was eminently practical, if not the slightest bit romantic. It would be a legal arrangement, Dooley said to Olive. A marriage on paper. He needs the claim, you need the roof. The cabin on his land has 2 rooms. He is quiet, and he keeps to himself, and he will not bother you. I do not need a husband, Olive said. No, but you need a roof, and November is coming. Olive went to the claim. She rode out alone on a borrowed horse on a Saturday morning in late October, when the air was cold and the sky was the flat gray of a Nebraska autumn, and the cottonwoods along the Elkhorn had turned a brilliant yellow and were dropping their leaves in slow spirals that covered the ground beneath them in gold. The cabin was set back from the river, in a clearing surrounded by the timber that Jonas had planted. 12 acres of young trees, some of them 8 feet tall, arranged in rows that were straight and even, and tended with a precision that surprised her, because the careful tending of trees in straight rows is not the work of a careless or indifferent man. Jonas was in the timber when she arrived. He was pruning a row of box elders with a handsaw, cutting the lower branches with precise, deliberate strokes to encourage upward growth, and the rhythmic sound of the saw was the only sound in the clearing besides the wind and the river. He saw her ride into the clearing, and he stopped sawing, and he set down the saw and walked to the cabin and stood in the yard with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man who has been told to expect a visitor, and who has been dreading the visit all morning. "I am Olive Mackey," she said. "I know who you are," Dooley told me. "Then you know why I am here. I know what Dooley proposed. He wrote to me about it. I am not sure why you agreed." My roof fell in. Jonas looked at her. He looked at her with the directness that was characteristic of him. The directness of a man who spends his days with trees, and who has absorbed from them the patient habit of standing still and observing carefully before acting. "The cabin has 2 rooms," he said. "The front room has the stove and the table. The back room has a bed. You would take the back room. I would sleep in the front room on the cot I already have. The arrangement would be legal and nothing more." "Nothing more," Olive said. "Nothing more." They were married by the Justice of the Peace on a Tuesday in November, 3 days before the government inspector arrived. The ceremony took 4 minutes in a cold office that smelled of pipe tobacco and ink. There were no guests and no flowers and no music. The justice read the words, and Jonas said the words, and Olive said the words, and the words were legal and binding and entirely without sentiment or decoration, which was what both of them wanted, or what both of them believed they wanted at the time, which is not always the same thing, and which in this case turned out to be not the same thing at all. The government inspector came on Friday morning in a buckboard. He was a thin man in a federal suit who inspected the timber with a clipboard and a measuring tape, counted the trees row by row, measured the acreage with a chain, examined the health of the plantings by pulling down branches and checking the bark for disease and the buds for vigor. He inspected the cabin, the stove, the provisions, the sleeping arrangements, and noted the presence of a wife. He signed the paperwork with a fountain pen, and Jonas Hamill's timber claim was approved, and the 160 acres of bottomland along the Elkhorn River were his, legally and permanently, and the 4 years of work had not been for nothing. By all rights, the arrangement should have ended there. The legal purpose had been served. The claim was secure. Olive had a roof. The transaction was complete. But transactions between 2 people who share a cabin and a stove and a table and a life, even a life that is defined as nothing more, do not remain transactions. They become something else, something unplanned and organic. They become routines, and routines become habits, and habits become the architecture of a shared existence that is more durable than any legal arrangement, because it is built not on paper, but on the accumulated days of living in proximity to another person, and discovering that the daily proximity is not the burden you expected, but the comfort you did not know you needed. Olive cooked. She had not planned to cook. The arrangement did not include cooking, but the stove was there, and the food was there, and the kitchen was 6 feet from where she slept, and the sitting idle at the table while someone else ate a meal she had not helped prepare was awkward in a way that cooking was not, and so she cooked. She made biscuits with lard and salt pork and strong black coffee in the morning, and she made soup or stew in the evening, and the meals were simple and good, and Jonas ate them with the quiet, deep gratitude of a man who has been eating his own terrible cooking for 5 years, and who has just discovered, through the revelation of a properly made biscuit, that his cooking was considerably worse than he had allowed himself to believe. Jonas cut firewood. He had always cut firewood, but now he cut more of it, and he stacked it closer to the door, and he split it carefully into smaller pieces, because he had noticed one morning that Olive's hands were considerably smaller than his, and that the smaller pieces were easier for her to feed into the stove. And the noticing of her hands was the first noticing, the first in a long series of noticings that accumulated over the weeks and months, the way his trees accumulated rings, invisibly, one at a time, but with a cumulative effect that was undeniable. He noticed, sometime in the 2nd week, that she sang while she sewed, not loudly, quietly, under her breath, hymns and folk songs and the occasional melody that he did not recognize, and the singing filled the small cabin with a warmth and a presence that had nothing whatsoever to do with the stove. He noticed that she read by lamplight in the evenings, holding the book close to the lamp, because her eyesight was not strong in dim light, and the lamplight on her face made her look like something from a painting, though Jonas did not think in terms of paintings, but in terms of light, because light was the thing he understood best in this world, having spent 4 years watching it move through the branches of the trees he had planted. Olive noticed things about Jonas. She noticed that he talked to the trees, not in words, in sounds, small murmurs and assessments that he made as he walked the rows, checking the bark and the buds and the growth, the way a doctor checks a patient. She noticed that his hands, which were large and rough and darkened by the soil, were gentle with the seedlings, cupping them with a tenderness that contradicted the rough, scarred strength of his hands. She noticed that he left wildflowers on the table in a jar of water, not for her, not deliberately, but because he picked them absently in the timber while checking his rows, and brought them inside, and set them down, and the setting down happened to be on the table, and the flowers happened to be beautiful, and the beauty of them, sitting in the jar in the center of the rough pine table, happened to be noticed, and happened to matter. Winter came. The winter in northeastern Nebraska was severe and long. Deep snow that covered the timber rose to the second branch, bitter cold that froze the river solid, wind that cut through the cabin walls and made the stove work harder than it was designed to work. The cabin was small and the cold was large, and the combination of cold and proximity compressed their lives into a small, warm space that was intimate, whether they intended it to be or not. They ate together. They sat by the stove together. They talked in the evenings by the stove, not about the arrangement or the claim or the legal fiction that their marriage represented, but about the things that people talk about when they are sharing a life: the weather, the wood supply, the price of flour at the general store, the health of the trees in the north row, the book Olive was reading and whether she recommended it, the fence that needed mending in the spring, the geese that had been landing on the river in increasing numbers. The talking became the thing that surprised them both. It surprised Jonas because he had believed he preferred silence, and the belief had been true until the silence had something to compare itself to, and the something was Olive's voice, which was low and clear, and which said things that were interesting and sometimes funny, and which filled the spaces in his day that the silence had previously filled, and the filling was better than the silence had been, which was an admission that cost him something, because the silence had been his identity, and identities, once built, are expensive and difficult to revise. It surprised Olive because she had believed the arrangement was temporary, a roof for the winter, a solution to a problem, a practical response to a practical need, and the belief had been true until the practicality had developed edges that were not practical at all, but were warm and surprising and specific to the man who cut the firewood into small pieces and who left wildflowers on the table and who talked to his trees in the quiet voice of a man who loves the things he has made. In March, when the snow began to melt and the river began to rise and the first buds appeared on the cottonwoods, Olive said, "The arrangement was for the winter." "Yes," Jonas said. "The winter is ending." "Yes, I should find another place." Jonas was quiet. He was quiet for a long time, the particular quiet of a man who is deciding whether to say the thing that will change everything. Outside the cabin, the trees he had planted were beginning their 5th year of growth, and the growth was visible to anyone who cared to look. New branches reaching upward, new pale green leaves unfurling in the spring light, the slow, patient accumulation of a forest that had started as 100 saplings in a cleared field. "The cabin has 2 rooms," he said, "but it does not need to." Olive looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the back room could still be yours, and the front room could be ours, together, and the arrangement could become whatever we decide we want it to be, and what I would like it to be is not an arrangement but a marriage." Olive was quiet. She was quiet the way the clearing was quiet in the morning, before the wind started and the birds began and the river woke up, a quiet that was not empty but full of the buds and the meltwater and the first warm air, and the man sitting across from her who had just said the truest thing he had ever said. "I would like that too," she said. The narrow cot in the front room was carried out to the barn on a warm morning in April, and neither of them mentioned it again. The cabin became a house, and the clearing became a homestead, and the arrangement became a marriage, a real one, built on small noticings and wildflowers, and the sound of singing while sewing. And the timber along the Elkhorn grew taller every year, planted by a man who understood that the things worth having are the things that grow slowly and patiently, one ring at a time, in silence, and in light, and in the company of the right person.